need to read the minutes of the last meeting. Won't take long.
Okay. I think we are all here, so we will make a start. Welcome to everyone to the Society of Antiquaries this evening. Thank you all for coming along and joining us in person. We're just going to read the minutes of the last meeting. So, Brian?
Okay. Right. An ordinary meeting of the Royal Archaeological Institute was held in the rooms of the Society of Antiquaries of London on Wednesday, 10th April 2024 at 5 p.m. The President, Ms. Lindsay Allison-Jones, was in the chair. Dr. Katie Howarth presented a paper on Life and Death on the Edge, Regionality, Connectivity and Networks in 5th and 6th century Cambridgeshire. Questions were asked by Rupert Jackson, Kate Starling, David Henton and Lindsay Allison-Jones, and the meeting ended at 6:05 p.m.
Okay. Is everyone content that I sign the minutes of the meeting on Lindsay's behalf? Okay. Okay, so I will come and do that on my way past. That's all right. So this evening's lecture, it is such a pleasure to welcome Professor John Collis, unfortunately not in person, but virtually this evening. John last spoke to the Society 3 years ago when he was talking on the Celts and the end of Rome and Britain. John is the Emeritus Professor at the University of Sheffield and has worked extensively in Europe and the UK, writing on the European Iron Age, on oppida and defended sites of the late Latin in Central and Western Europe, as well as on excavation techniques. This evening's lecture is entitled The Maison Domat, Mirefleurs, France, Stories of Ancient and Modern Celts, Romans, Bourbons, Stuarts, and Hollywood, which sounds like an enormous scope for this evening's lecture. So it is a real pleasure to welcome John to the screen this evening, and we're so sorry that he couldn't be here with us in person. So I will hand over to John now.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes?
You can hear me? Yes, I'm just wondering how I load my PowerPoint.
If you press share screen on your PowerPoint, it should come up hopefully at this end for us. We can definitely hear you.
Right. I better...
Where the green one is, share screen should be fine. You need to come out of the way.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so I can start talking then.
Yes, unless you want to go on to presenter view, that's the only other thing, to just show your whole slide, but that's up to you, John.
Sorry, just...
So if you, don't worry, I think if you want to make a start, if you're happy, that sounds great. Thank you.
Right. Yes, this is about a project which was started off with help from the RAI. And as you can see, it's something which is shot off in all sorts of directions, which is indicated by this title. We'll perhaps start off with Hollywood. And some of you may have noticed many years ago that or sorry, a number of months ago, that there was a sale of iconic articles and clothing from film and television. And the one that hit the headlines was £20,000 for Colin Firth sweatshirt from Pride and Prejudice. But the second highest one was for a dress worn by Drew Barrymore in a film entitled Ever After, a Cinderella story. And it's a film which, in fact, is shown quite commonly on television. And so some of you may have seen it. And the story it starts off with Jean Moreau playing a grande dame, talking to the brothers Grimm about the origins of the story of Cinderella, saying it relates to one of her ancestors, Danielle de Barbarac, who is played by Drew Barrymore. Her mother dies young, father remarries, but then he also dies, leaving her under the control of her stepmother and exploited by her and her sisters. But she meets a young prince, Henry, whose father, King Francis, played by Timothy West, is arranging for him to be married to a Spanish princess. Now, the dating of this story is somewhere in the early 16th century. We are told that Danielle's favorite book is Thomas More's Utopia, which her father gave her, which was published in 1516. The king, Francois I, started ruling in 1515 and went on to 1547. What dates it a bit more, or a bit of it at any rate, a bit more precisely, is that the prince's mentor is Leonardo da Vinci, who was in France from 1516 to 1519, and who was buried at Amboise, which was the main residence of the French court at that time. But most of the elements, in fact, come from a little bit later, from the 1530s. And so the prince, the actual prince, Henri, was born, in fact, in 1519 and became Dauphin on the death of his brother in 1536 and finally became king in 1547. But there are various things that also point out date more in the 1530s, like a comment that divorce is something you only do in England, which is obviously a reference to Anne Boleyn. Some things just don't fit. Amboise Abbey, where the lovers meet, is a ruin, but in fact wasn't destroyed until the French Revolution. So they play a little bit fast and loose with the chronology, but it does very much take us in the 16th century. And then Jean Moreau says the truth of the romance has been reduced to a simple fairy story. Well, what I'm going to do this evening is look a little bit more, perhaps, at some of the background to this particular story. At any rate, let's just leave that hanging for the moment, and let's get ourselves placed on the map. And we are, in fact, in the Auvergne in central France, near the city of Clermont-Ferrand. And the village I'm talking about, Mirefleurs, about 20 kilometers to the southeast. It's now very much a dormitory town for Clermont-Ferrand. And this is a territory, the Auvergne is named after the Gallic tribe of the Arverni. Now, what originally took me there was my doctoral thesis, which I wrote on urbanization, largely because my hometown, Winchester, was thought to be an oppidum. I don't think it was, but that's another story. But my doctoral thesis was finished in 1974, and for it, I'd done a fair amount of traveling around France and indeed around Europe, looking at sites. And it was eventually published as oppida, earliest towns north of the Alps. But one of the problems that I accentuated was that there was a bit of a problem of what actually came before the oppida. Where did the populations come from? This was the area that I was dealing with in my thesis from Brittany at one end, right the way across to the Hungarian plain, down into the central and southern France, and up into central Germany. And this is where the sites occurred that I referred to as oppida. And one of the things that I was looking for, as I said, was the evidence of earlier sites. Sorry, yeah. When I started my tour, I was a complete novice, and I'd been given the address of Wolfgang Dane, who was the leading expert on oppida at that time, and asked him to give me names of people I could visit while touring around France. And one of them, who lived in Saint-Étienne at that time, was Robert Perrichon. And he was digging a site near Clermont-Ferrand, the site of Aulnat, site we now call La Grande Borne because of a standing menhir next to it, always thought to be Chalcolithic, though we now know it's contemporary with the Iron Age settlement. And I visited him in about 1967, and he said, well, if you've got nothing to do sometime, do come down and join our excavation. But it was not until sort of 1972 that I began to run out of my excavations in England were coming to an end. So I went out with a small group of Sheffield students to work on this site that he was excavating, which seemed to be a good example of the site which could be preceding the oppida. And I was very fortunate in my choice. He just said to me, well, this was his excavation back there. He just pointed to an area of the field and said, well, you go and excavate there and excavate in the English method. We'll be interested to see what you do. And so you can see here my team of mainly Sheffield students at that stage working on what for then in France was quite a large area of one of these sites, but for me was rather on the small side. At that stage, I was mainly financed by the University of Sheffield, not much, and students who were then able to get grants to do field work. But needing a bit of money to get me going, I applied to the RAI and got a grant from the RAI, and that is why my first interim report about Aulnat is published in the Archaeological Journal. Later on, I got finance from the American organization Volunteers Earthwatch, which took me up to 1991. But it meant that I was able to excavate it in the British way. Over much of the continent at this time, the normal excavation was to dig in spits rather than dig stratigraphically, as we tended to in Britain. And of course, we were also moving over to what is now referred to as open area excavation. This was really a small area excavation, and certainly my French colleagues didn't understand why I was digging holes all over the place. But what obviously I was doing was I was excavating pits as we identified them, and ditches, and this thing running across here, which seemed to be a hollow way, and trying to work out the stratigraphical sequences of ditches like this. It was mainly learning the difference between black soil and black soil, the rich, fertile soils of the Grand Limagne. But it became clear that this was part of, or in fact already, that it was part of a larger settlement, and part of it had been excavated as rescue collection of material during the war, when an airbase was constructed, later turned into a regional airport. And but it was very clear that this site, referred to sometime as Aulnat or Aulnat Clermont-Ferrand, it covers the two areas. But it was a settlement starting off somewhere around 300 BC and going up to about 100 BC when it seemed to be abandoned, and which is the period when the oppida were coming into existence. And a number of excavations took place in that time. Brezé, Pontchartrault, and Gondole, Sainte-Anne, and it seemed to start emerging as one of perhaps one of the largest latin settlements in Europe, a big open settlement of urban proportions. And here, just a look at another excavation, Gondole, which took place underneath the airport, which was done by the local archaeologists. So we had really hit the sort of site I was looking for. And I quickly realized this is a rather old map now, but there were a number of other open settlements of this sort across central France and into southern Germany. Since I drew this map, we now know of a whole series of sites across in Czechoslovakia, sites like Nebiesice, in southern Poland, and right the way across to Ukraine. So this site became one of the examples of these early, possibly urban sites. One of the things I should be coming to is what we nowadays call networking, the sort of connections that exist. And to set up my project, I had to try and get hold of a labor force. I had been excavating in Exeter and at Osselbury and near Winchester, and so I was calling on the people who had worked with me there. But I also had very close links with David Neal, who was excavating his Roman villas at Hemel Hempstead, and obviously I also had my Sheffield students. But another thing that was very useful was the setup, which was just beginning to come into existence, of national conferences in France. What turned into the Association Française pour l'étude de l'âge de fer. And we held one of their conferences at the airport at Aulnat, organized by Robert Perichon. And through this connection, I was meeting people who were like Alan Duval, the secretary, Olivier Buxenschutz, who was doing similar things to me on the other side of the Massif Central in the Berry, a young man called Vincent Guichard, who was just a student at that time, and also another person who became a good colleague, Ian Ralston, from Edinburgh. So this was the sort of group that we were putting together, and just to show the sort of relationships that developed. The main publisher of our excavators is a Frenchman called Jan de Berge, but he married an English lady called Jemima Dunkley, who was also an excavator, but both of her parents worked for both David Neal and me. So it was very much more than just a work connection. From one of these connections, we decided one of the things we needed to do was starting to put this site into context and start doing systematic field walking. And so Olivier Buxenschutz and myself put together a joint project to do field walking around his sites. The first systematic excavation, so field walking done on Iron Age sites in central France. So really a new concept of trying to put these sites into their wider context. And this was organized by Nigel Mills, who was finishing off his Sheffield PhD on field walking in the south of France at that time, and had the advantage of speaking very fluent French, albeit with a Marseille accent. And from this, we were then able to put our site of Aulnat down here into context, showing that it was just one, it was the concentration of occupation, but with a large amount of occupation on the Grand Limagne, on the rich soils, and on the adjacent areas. So here we're beginning to look at very much more at not individual sites, but really looking at landscapes. And this is the evidence that we had putting all of it together for this period immediately preceding the oppida. And from this, and working, following up the constructions of motorways in this area, we were able to identify one or two new sites. And for the first time, using the Earthwatch money and the opportunity of an area which was going to be left open for a few years, where there was a planned junction of this motorway, which you can see already constructed here, which is the one that goes from Paris, Bourges, and then on down to Montpellier in southern France. But the point where there was planned to be a junction with a supplementary motorway to Lyon. And for the first time, we were able to get in mechanical excavators and excavate a large area. And you can see immediately that we, underneath this black soil, we seem to be dealing with a planned landscape of some sort. And this site, which we now refer to as Pateral, it's just about 5 or 6 kilometers north of the Aulnat complex, so an independent settlement. But it starts off our not necessarily the earliest occupation, but the earliest obvious activity was Hallstatt Inhumation Cemetery. And then the Iron Age rural settlement, which in normal terms went from La Tène A to La Tène D1 from the 5th century up to the end of the 2nd century BC. But then there was an early Roman cremation cemetery. But there was a gap in the occupation, which was contemporary with the foundation of the oppida. So it looks as though the population had perhaps moved into the oppida, but there was a continuity of the use of the field boundaries and so on. So a combination of continuity and change. And our excavations at these sites just shows the sorts of things we were finding at Le Grand Bourne and in the Aulnat complex. Here are some of the quite amazing fine painted pottery, which we started discovering, some with very obviously fairly standard La Tène ornament, red on white decorated pottery, but also these quite amazing animals, half bird, half deer, or whatever they are, something which was entirely new at that time, and which has since become very familiar. And those of you who saw the British Museum exhibition about a decade ago on Celtic art and so on, and the Celts, will have seen some of these pots, not sadly from my excavations, but the three on the right literally came from just the other side of the main road from where I was excavating from a French excavation. So from art historical point of view, very interesting, but also from the industrial point of view, the sorts of things that one would normally expect to find on oppida were going on this, this open settlement. A lot of industrial occupation, evidence of glass working, of bone working, working of textiles and leather, and a lot of evidence for the working of bronze and silver and gold from lots of fragments of crucibles, and even coin manufacture going on our site at Le Grand Bourne. But also evidence of the development of the trade with the Mediterranean. In the early phase, very little coming in, but things like coral inlays for decorations of one sort. And then we start getting influences in the cooking with the importation of Mediterranean-style mortaria. And then the fine plates, first the Campanian wares, which the black wares, which were in many ways the predecessors of the red Samian pottery we're so familiar with. And then there's a huge expansion in the 2nd century BC with large quantities of amphorae and fine wares coming in. And also one or two nice little objects, this Roman intaglio, but also rather strangely, a Roman roof tile. And this threw my chronology for a while. I thought this must be from a post-conquest bit. But we now know that Teguli roof tiles were being traded around in Gaul, not for making roofs. They had just been traded singly and probably just being used as some sort of hearth bottoms or something of that sort. My team, it was very convenient for us because fairly close to the excavation, Robert had organized for a field to be arranged for camping to take place, and which we were able to use. And nearby there was the French air base, which was then part of the airport of Aulnat. And he knew a few of the officers there and arranged for running water and tents for cooking and so on to be provided. And it's a place that we use for the Sheffield team up to the end of our excavations at La Grande Borne up to 1981. Initially, Robert was staying in a hotel, but in the second year, he decided to move in with us. But he was having a problem with the noisy British students who tended to make a bit of noise at night. But we also didn't have a permanent building where we could have proper storage of finds and equivalent and equipment. And this is where the first of our sort of odd occurrences, a sort of joker suddenly coming out of the pack, which very much influenced the way things subsequently developed. And this was a local person, a man called Ezio Arduini, who in 1974 arrived with a tomato box with pottery in it and on our campsite and asked if we knew what it was. And Robert immediately became very interested to see typical Iron Age pottery contemporary with our settlement. And so he went up to have a look at the site, and talking to Ezio, he said, well, we're looking for a house to use. And he said, well, we have a local landowner, Henri Defoy, who owns a number of houses which are not being used, some of them in a fairly wrecked state, but we can talk to him. And this was how we, the French team, moved into the Maison Domat and started using the barns attached to it in this village of Mirefleurs. And it's a building and barns that we continue to use ever since. And Henri also provided us with a wonderful campsite just 5 minutes walk from the house, which overlooked the valley, and we could see 3 oppida from there with Corent, Gergovie, and another site which I was later to discover. And so we really had fallen on our feet there. And this is the house that we were looking at. It's a 16th century house. It lacked a few luxuries like windows and the odd floor, and certainly was no heating. But we were told it was a very interesting historically because it seemed to be one of the homes of a man called Jean Domat, who was a 17th century jurist, a man who codified much of French law, which was then used as the basis of the Napoleon's code. But he was also a friend of Blaise Pascal and was the executor of his will and did a sketch drawing of him. At that stage, the only thing of interest other than the building itself was that in the tower, and we see the tower here, which seems to be a 17th century addition, that up here there were a whole series of paintings which had been accidentally discovered and then uncovered and conserved. And a rather peculiar mixture there was. You can see there's a great hodgepodge on the left-hand side of buildings, some of them extremely well made, but others really just sketches. Rather nice horse there. Sadly, we've never had a proper study of the whole lot, but there are also sort of sketches of buildings, presumably a view of the village or one of the local villages. But for us, one of the most interesting things was one of the crudest drawings, and it's this one of a side view of a woman, and written across it in pencil here in graphite is Mademoiselle Jeannette Domat La Camuse. And so this was a bit of evidence that in the 17th century, this was indeed the residence of the Domat family, which had been brought into doubt. So poor Mademoiselle Jeannette Domat is remembered now for her snub nose. The French stayed there for about 2 or 3 years, but then moved on, in part because of claims that they were making too much noise. So I felt a slight twist on what had happened earlier on. But we still had a lot of materials sort of stored up there. We used to go and visit them for celebrations like Bastille Day. But when Nigel Mills started his field walking, he said, well, where can my team stay? And I said, well, go and talk to this man, Henri de Foy, and see whether you can use the Maison Domat. And so it became the English team moved in with Nigel Mills, not only while he was field walking, but he actually spent a winter there. Not a thing to be recommended in a house with no windows and heating. But come 1982, when I decided that I was going to continue working in central France, I too needed somewhere to have as my base. And I talked to Henri, and he said, well, you might as well continue using the Maison Domat. And it has been our base ever since that time. So now something like 40 years. And we were able to use it for not merely for storage, but for finds analysis, cooking and providing meals for our teams. And then as we moved on to trial excavations and the large scale excavations, we were able to keep fairly large teams of about 30, 40 people based on this house and the campsite. And so here is another view of the Maison Domat seen from the front. And as you can see, a really very nice 16th century house, though a little bit mucked up about later, but a good number of the original features in there. And this is the French and English team, which we managed to set up. I was running into problems really in the 1980s, though I speak a sort of French. I picked it up on the hoof. I was certainly in no position to write fluent French, which was increasingly being needed for me to make my official reports. I was also having problems getting permits because people didn't really understand why this Englishman was wanting to dig in France. And my French colleagues in the FAF said, well, you really need a Frenchman to be working with you. And we suggested this young student, well, he was just moving on from being a student, Vincent Guichard, as perhaps a person who is working on the Iron Age and is publishing Iron Age things. He might be willing to work with you. Unbeknown to me, the Direction des Antiquités, who were people who dealt with all the permits and who had initially refused me a permit, they wanted someone to deal with the Iron Age and perhaps to keep me on control. and they also had approached Vincent Guichard. So he was the ideal candidate. He brought the two parties together. And he said immediately, what we need to do is to set up a société, something, an official organization which can ask for and deal with funds from the public organizations in France, from the local villages, from the department, and from the national government. And so this was set up originally with just three of us, myself as president, Vincent as secretary, and a lady who had been working with Olivier Buxenschutz on various things, Christine Jouanet, who lived in a nearby village. Subsequently, there was a coup d'etat at an annual meeting, which I wasn't able to get to. And so I was promoted or demoted to be honorary president, and Vincent took over the president. It made it much easier to get all the documents signed and so on. And Christine then became secretary, and her husband, Jean, became our treasurer. And then 2 or 3 years later, at the request of various other people who were working in the Auvergne, it was open to all students and researchers working in the Auvergne. It still exists. It has its base in the Maison Domat. I think it has about 70 or 80 people at the moment. And it has proved a very lively organization for bringing Iron Age research in central France together. So one of our successes. Getting French funds allowed us to employ a full-time assistant, and this is where this man, Jan de Berge, came in, and he moved into the village, living there for a while, and still lives locally, and he was working on the pottery and other artifacts. But we also had other doctoral students like Lionel Lorengo working on the ironwork, and Sylvain Foucra working on the animal bones, which was a major job. I mean, just from my own excavation at La Grande Borne. It was a small area, but nonetheless, I had over 100,000 animal bones from it, so it was very rich material. When he got bored with looking at the pottery, Jan decided he would start trying to do some work on the house. We managed to put in new windows, as you can see, and Jan started recognizing that, in fact, in the main house as well, there were lots of paintings, some the original decoration for the house when it was constructed, but also sort of lots of sketches and so on of various types. So the house itself was becoming more interested, and we started unblocking the chimneys. You can see one of them just to the left, unblocking some of the windows that had been blocked up. And I don't know, really solved the heating, but it is now a very nice house to work in. That started putting us in a position to start undertaking fairly large projects. And I'll just quickly take you through 2 or 3 of the things that Arafa managed to get up to. I've already mentioned this new motorway, which was being planned to meet at my site of Pateral, going over and linking up with a motorway which went across to Lyon. And it was a 7-kilometer stretch going across the Grand Liman. And what we were able to do was drainage trenches had to be dug on either side of the road. So it was Arafa that dug these sort of trial trenches 7 kilometers long across the Grand Liman, and gave us a chance to see what underlay the areas where we were doing all the field walking. So we were able to start undertaking fairly extensive rescue excavations of this kind. One of the finds that came from that, well, a couple of burials from a site called Chania, and just one of them was in a pit with a nice set of pottery in it, just after the Roman conquest, so the very end of the La Tène, but with a very nice La Tène sword in it and a spear, and pig bones, but interestingly, no human bones. And I still like to claim that this is perhaps the richest pig burial we have in the late Iron Age in Europe. But one of the big things that I had started doing was trying to work out a new chronology. And so a big project was set up under Christine Jouanet and Jan de Berge to look at the whole of the chronology in the Auvergne. And I put this on with all the people whose names appear as the authors, just to emphasize this was very much a collaborative affair, including people from all over the Auvergne, and we were able to provide what I think is now probably a fairly massive volume which has come out, which is probably one of the best Iron Age chronologies we have anywhere in La Tène, Europe. And it was based, what had never really been done before in France, was to base this on stratified groups of material. So the key groups of stratified material were illustrated and drawn. Here, just one of the things that was crossing my excavation was what seemed to be a hollow way. And when I gave the features numbers, I called them, this was feature 8. But my interpretation of it as a road, it then became Chemin 8, and a really rich collection of late early La Tène material. And so we have all the pottery here, but also a whole series of brooches, and being able to tie together the chronologies of the different sorts of artifacts in a way which had never really been done before. And here, another pit from my excavation with a whole lot of painted pottery. And you've already seen this, this pot with its La Tène decoration on it. But seeing the full range of pottery that was coming out from these very rich sites, but again with what seemed to be late middle La Tène brooches. I still, the student who dug that up went on to greater things. It was actually dug by Chris Gosden, who became the successor to Barry Cunliffe at Oxford. So we started off somebody's interesting career anyway. What we gradually began to realize that the sequence of oppida around this area around Clermont-Ferrand was actually rather complicated. And working with a man called Fernand Malachet, who had been working, who was the local numismatist and who had done a lot of identification of the coinage, including for me, and a huge collection from a site called Corent, this site here. We worked out what we thought was a chronology, starting off with Aulnat from really the from the second century BC, followed then by the site up here at Corent, and then this other site, which I mentioned briefly, a site called Gondole, which was really unknown as an oppidum when we first went there. Then that followed by the great traditional site of Gergovie, and then finally the foundation of the Roman town here, Clermont-Ferrand, at Augusto Nemeton. So we were beginning to put something of a sequence together for these sites. Recently, we always thought of this site of Corent sitting up on top of this hill as a site without defences, but in the last few years it's been recognised in the field boundaries around it that does have a Murus Gallicus. There is also an open settlement down here at Le Bay, which seems to be a sort of port site on the River Allier, which we can see here flowing at its foot. Vincent, I did a bit of field walking up there, and then Vincent started doing some excavation across a square field, which looked a bit peculiar in the context of the other fields at Corent, and quickly realized that underneath the modern dry stone wall, there was an ancient wall belonging to a Roman temple. And underneath the Roman temple, an Iron Age temple with animal offerings and amphorae and so on inside a ditched enclosure. We decided that that was really too much of an excavation for us to take on, and eventually it was taken over by Mathieu Pou, who initially worked with us, but then decided he wanted his own setup based in Le Martre de Verre. And he has produced a whole series of major reports and publications on the site of Corent. Here is one of his plans of his excavations. Here is the sanctuary, the Iron Age sanctuary that we mentioned, but then this enormous complex of settlements, masses of amphorae, gold brooches, coins, goodness knows what, a really rich and impressive site. And here the one of his the monographs that he has produced. The other site I've mentioned is Gondole, and this again comes from networks. My landlord, Henri de Foy, said to me that he bumped into old school friend that he hadn't seen for many years, who lived in a chateau at a place called Gondole, and the site was threatened by an expansion of the local village, and he was worried about the loss of what he thought ought to be an archaeological site, but was certainly not a site which was listed. I went rather reluctantly. I didn't want to get messed up with medieval excavations. But as soon as I got to the site and looked at the defenses, which various people had said might be Caesar's camp from the siege of Gergovie, or could be Viking, or could be medieval to go with the chateau. As soon as I went down to it, I recognized this as an Iron Age defense, so what Wheeler called a fécamp rampart, with a huge bank and a very wide ditch in front of it. So suddenly we had another oppidum, and let's just go back. But there were plans to put in a road alongside this, coming along here and cutting through the part of the rampart here and going on across here. And in advance of that, there were one or two trial excavations, and just here, the excavator for INRAP, Julius Caesar, he found a number of pits with bones sticking out. He only excavated one, and it became one of the icons of late rescue excavation in France. I first found out about it from a phone call from the Daily Mail, who wanted to write a piece about it. But from the early first century BC, a burial with lineup of 8 horses and 8 men, some sort of ritual burial. And we now know quite a number of similar sorts of burials, mainly generally of horses in this area. Subsequently, Anne de Berge has done excavations on the settlement area. There was external occupation, part of it pre-conquest, part of it post-conquest, but again, another rich settlement with evidence of pottery kilns and so on. The one thing I desperately avoided trying to do was the local conflict was which was where was the Battle of Gergovie, and the story of Caesar and Vercingetorix. The Arverni had been defeated in 123 BC when they took an army under Bituitos to Provence and as the most powerful tribe at that time. They suffered a major defeat, but they were left outside the expanding empire. But at the time of Caesar, we encountered this man, Vercingetorix, really considered the first great French hero, supposedly born in Gergovia, and he was the man who led the revolt against Caesar. And at the site of Gergovia, he defeated Caesar, and this led to the big revolt, uniting most of Gaul against the Romans, but finally, of course, the defeat at Alesia. And the site that had traditionally been considered from about the 16th century onwards as the site of this battle was the Plateau de Merdon, just south of Clermont-Ferrand. And in the 19th century, General Stoffel carried out excavations here. I've never known quite what his techniques were, but they seem to have been very good, because he picked up what he thought was the large camp as described by Caesar, the small camp up here, and the linking ditches. And then Napoleon did this reconstruction of the attack on Gergovia, in which the Romans were routed and had to retreat. There was a local conflict going on between two amateur teams as to where this battle was, and two sites were put forward. There was the Plateau de Merdon, but there's another site called the Côte de Clermont. And I desperately avoided trying to get into this local conflict. But in the end, as a big neutral group, we were asked to undertake this political hot potato. And Vincent Guichard excavated on looking at the sites that Stoffel had claimed he had found. And indeed, they were there. This is the view looking down at the area of the Roman fort. And here, Vincent's excavation across the defenses with military equipment turning up in them. And on the site of the big camp, the large camp, it only just survives. It's been heavily eroded, but here is the ditch as identified by Stoffel. That is Gergovia in the background. But all the material we got seemed to be 1st century BC, mid-1st century BC, with various bits of military equipment. So for us, there was no doubt about this being the site of the battle. The other site of the Côte de Clermont, the Iron Age material was there, but it was too early. The Roman material was there, but it was too late. And what were claimed to be the defenses just seemed to be revetment walls for the fields and vines. We carried out excavations on Gergovia, brought in an Austrian team under Thomas Pertelweiser and Wieser and Iris Ott, and trying to look at the defenses, which you can see running around the edge of the site. But here is their excavation. But the defenses, in fact, are too early. They belong to Holstadt D. There is a later wall, a stone wall, but that seems to be Augustan, and then a little early Roman cemetery on the edge. This edge just here is actually the edge of a trench excavated by Christopher Hawkes in the 1930s. So a long British tradition here. There is a little bit of material now contemporary with Caesar from from Gergovie, but not much. It doesn't seem to be really a big major urban settlement until we get to the Augustan period. So there's still a lot of argument going on about the nature of the hill forts and of the oppida. I still go mainly from the sequence, so modified a little bit because, for instance, the temple on Corent goes on later than the main occupation, whereas Matthew Pou sees it rather as a multi-polar town. And so we continue to argue about that bit of the interpretation. One of the other things I was getting involved in at this time, and which was the subject of my last lecture to the RAI, was the debate over the Celts and Celtic society. And I got into this because of disagreeing with Barry Cundiff's interpretation of Danebury as being a Celtic society. And it led on to quite a debate about how do we define the Celts? Were the people in Britain Celts or not? And for me, at any rate, there was not a Celtic society. There were very many different sorts of Celtic societies. And the question of when people in Britain started being considered Celts, very much followed up by J.D. Hill, and his work is sort of key in this area. Also dealing with problems about supposed origin and spread of the Celts. We're supposedly in the area where which was occupied by the Celts in the 3rd, 2nd century BC. All one can say is this much produced map seems to bear very little relationship either to the archaeology or to the historic sources. It shows its links in a bit with the art, but that's all. But at any rate, these are things that I discussed in my book from 2005, and as mentioned, I lectured on this to the RAI in a rather improvised lecture, and I got a new book which I hope I'm going to finish over this winter called Celts, Ancient and Modern, updating some of the aspects. But at any rate, the Arverni are amongst the earliest group that are mentioned in this context of the Celts, and depending on which chronology you use, 600, 400 BC, the Arverni joined the Bituriges in the invasion of Italy. We're told by various sources that the Arverni were the most powerful and warlike tribe in Gaul. And we hear about their kings, Luernios and Bituitos. Luernios, the richest man in all Gaul in the 2nd century BC. But it's also, this area is the last mention of what I call the ancient Celts. For me, the ancient Celts end in the 5th century BC, and they don't reappear. We don't find people who are being called Celts until we come to the Renaissance. And the last mention is Sidonius Apollinaris, who lived in a village now called Ada, Avitarchus, and Bishop of Clermont-Ferrand. And he describes the lake next to the villa, and he talks about the Arverni suffering from the scurf of the Celtic tongue. His father-in-law, Celt, Avitus, became Roman emperor. Where is his villa? Well, C.E. Stevens wrote a book about Sidonius Apollinaris and had to admit there's really no idea. I think it was probably underneath the church at Ada. You can just see the spire sticking up there. And this is on the basis of another excavation we were involved in, which was the excavation of a church site, but where one could demonstrate that it started off as a Roman villa with these two rooms here, which were then turned into a burial area, and then this evolved into a church and priory, which was finally abandoned in the 17th century. But we now come on to the birth of the modern Celts, very briefly, and George Buchanan, who was the first, for me, the first historian to suggest the ancient inhabitants of Britain and Ireland were Celts, in his book in 1582, Rerum Scoticarum. And just remind ourselves that he was tutor also to Mary Queen of Scots and to James VI, James I, so it was somebody who was very much involved with the Stuarts. The other ancient building in Mirefleurs is the chateau, very much of it in ruins, though some of it is still occupied. But we were told when we went there that this was the home of a Scotsman, John Stuart, the Count of Comte d'Auvergne and the Duke of Albany, who lived from 1484 to 1536. And here a view of what his chateau may have originally looked like. And I haven't actually got a view from the chateau, but this is taken from the Maison Domat, and we're looking across the Grand Liman, and in the distance there you have the Puy de Dôme and all the volcanic range of the Massif Central. So a superb place to live. And how he came to be there, his father, Alexander, was the brother of James III, and he was exiled to France for conspiring against James. But there he married well. He married Anne de la Tour d'Auvergne, who was the Countess of the Auvergne. And John Stuart was born in 1484, but his father died in 1485. And so he, at a very early age, became the Comte d'Auvergne. But then he married another member of the Tour d'Auvergne family, his mother's niece, Anne. But when James IV was killed at Flodden, leaving behind James V, who was just a baby, John Stuart was appointed the regent of Scotland, along with Margaret Tudor, and was sole regent from 1515 to 1524. His niece, Madeleine de la Tour, married into the Medici family, married at Amboise in 1519. So you see, we're beginning to get round to the dates mentioned in our fairy story at the beginning. Both Madeleine and Lorenzo died in 1519, and they left a daughter, Catherine, Caterina Medici, and John Stuart became her guardian, along with a member of the Medici family, Pope Leo X. And after his death, he became her sole guardian. And so we have a man who has major connections with the Vatican, major connections with Florence, major connections with the French royal family, major connections with Scotland. So links right the way across Western Europe. In 1523, while he was in Scotland, he attacked the English at Wark Castle. And we know that in his army was George Buchanan, the first person to talk about the Celts. We also know that in 1533, there was a visit by Francois to Mirefleurs, who stayed in the chateau with John Stuart. And there was a marriage arranged between Catherine and Henri, though I believe that John Stuart would have preferred her marrying into the Scottish royal family. But at any rate, it was not a love match. The marriage between Catherine and Henri. Henri becomes Dauphin in 1536, and then becomes king in 1547, and Catherine becomes Queen of France. And again, the Stuart connection, Mary Queen of Scots was brought up in their court. Well, again, suddenly a wild card arrives, and I'm not only on the advisory committee, editorial committee for the RAI, but also for the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and normally looking at Iron Age excavations. But suddenly there was an article arrived entitled "The Artistic Patronage of John Stuart, Duke of Albany." The discovery of the artist and author Bremond Domat, which was finally published in the Society of Antiquaries in 2014 by Bryony Coombs, who produced a very interesting article linking three manuscripts. One, a summary history of Scotland, which had the innovation of doing imaginary portraits of all of the kings, but based on Scottish histories, that of John of Fordun and the Liber Pluscardenses. And it was noted that there was a manuscript in Glasgow of this, the Liber Pluscardenses, which had French notes in it. And there was also a history of a summary history of Scotland, a manuscript in Paris, and then a genealogy of Anne de la Tour in The Hague. And she suggested that these were all, in fact, written by the same person, and suggested that this was Bremond Domat. And we know also about Bremond Domat at the time of Francois' visits to Mirefleurs. He is helping to organize the king's visits to Realm, Montferrand, and Clermont. And he also notes an interesting illustration in one of these. And there's a peculiar thing in this, there's just the letter D here, which makes no sense in the context, unless, in fact, as she suggests, it actually stands for Domat. And she suggests that this is probably a self-portrait of this man, Bremond Domat. So back to the Maison Domat. Was this actually a building which was built by Bremond Domat? Was there actually a history of Scotland written there? We know that George Buchanan and Bremond Domat were in the employ of John Stuart at the same time, the one in Scotland and the other one in France. This history really is the very end of the fabricated stories. Okay, Catherine was an orphan, but she was no Cinderella. Sadly, we have no evidence of Da Vinci or Buchanan visiting. We have the Sheffield connection with Mary Stuart, but there are a lot of stories which gather together around this house, and I hope that the RAI will feel that from little acorns, mighty oak trees go. We've shot out in all directions and I think produced quite a lot of interesting stories. So I've slightly overrun, apologies, but I will stop.
Okay, thank you so much, John. That was an incredible journey across time, touching on so many different aspects. We have a couple of minutes if anyone would like to ask any questions, either from in the room or anyone who has joined us online. We can bring the mic to you so you can ask a question. Or it's possible that you've stunned us all into silence.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Is the Maison still used as a...
Sorry, I'm having problem hearing.
Is the Maison still used as a research centre, and what's its future?
I'm not quite sure what the future is. I mean, Henri is, well, he's older than mine. He must be getting up into his late 80s or so. And quite what is going to happen with his estate, I don't know. There have been some talks that this is now being recognized as a monument of national importance. And certainly the village, the people in the village are very eager that it should become a sort of showplace for the village. They've it was originally it was opposite the building which was used as the mairie, and so it was always called the Place de la Mairie. But they've now moved the mairie to another place and renamed the square the Place Jean Domat. Jean Domat. So they're certainly very keen to emphasize this, but they've only really just begun to catch up on what Bryony Coombs has been writing, and seeing that this is very much a very interesting part of the history of Mirefleurs, when it really was a political center for what was going on in Western Europe, and certainly they want to get some sort of involvement. So, but I haven't heard where the latest discussions are going on. I mean, Henri is someone who always has a bit of a suspicion of state organizations and so on, but he too really has recognized the special importance of this building. So I think it's a little bit of wait and see, and hopefully it we'll be able to do a real proper report on the building and on the paintings and so on. We've only just touched the surface of them. There's a lot more work to be done on the building and the paintings, both in the tower and in the main house itself.
Well, thank you, John. You've actually anticipated my question, which was, is there any further research planned on the paintings? Because they're absolutely fascinating. So that's...
Yes, some of them have been published. There is now a journal which is just started being published about a couple of years ago by the new group within ARIFA, and the present secretary, Remy Collis, has got together the group of archaeologists. We're not house specialists, but simply to look at a probable development of the house with the various additions and so on that have been taking place, and with photographs of some of the illustrations. But it really needs probably a team of people to be looking at the 14th, 15th century, the 15th, 16th century decorations and the building, but also this group of paintings. And so far, nobody in France seems to have been particularly interested. Perhaps we can appeal to somebody. Are you interested?
I'm sure we can find you someone. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions, or shall we just give John another big thank you from all of us here in London and from anyone watching online? Thank you so much, John. Thank you. Okay, did you want to say about the next?
Yes, next month, this is, we've found it very difficult to fill the lecture slot for November, which is why it's blank in your cards. But we can announce that we get Phil Harding coming for an in-person lecture only, so it won't be online, who'll be talking about Along the Line, My Life in Archaeology.
Should we draw this evening's proceedings to a close? Thank you so much.